Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about some interesting symbiotic relationships that plants have with other plants. From previous discussions we talked about really important symbiotic relationships that plants have with fungi and mutualistic, and those are mycorrhizae in the roots that help massively increase the surface area and absorption for plants, and also bacteria. So prokaryotes have mutualistic relationships with certain types of plants in their roots. Rhizobium is the bacteria that help them nitrogen fix and therefore increase the soil quality. But today I'd like to talk to you about parasitic plants. Now that's a type of relationship that the parasite is benefits but the host is harmed. And so there are some parasitic plants. And then I want to also talk to you about commensalism. In other words, one plant benefiting from another plant, and the other plant doesn't seem to mind at all. There's really no effect. And then finally in this conversation, I want to conclude with some really unusual types of plants, which are called carnivorous plants. And those are, just as the name implies, plants that eat animals or eat meat, carni. Pretty crazy. So you may be familiar with those already. So let's jump right into that conversation. So one of the great examples of a parasitic plant is good old mistletoe. Now mistletoe grows on top of another plant, and it actually is able to draw out some of the sap it siphons some of the xylem sap from the vascular tissue of the host tree. And so it's a negative effect on the host, mistletoe. And so I find that kind of interesting because sometimes mistletoe is revered as being something really important, especially around the holiday. It's a very odd, maybe someone can explain this to me someday, why when you stand underneath the mistletoe, it's an opportunity for a big kiss. I don't know. Maybe maybe there should be more plants this way. But why mistletoe? I don't know. So here's some other examples of parasitic plants. This guy right here called a dodder like this, dodder. It doesn't photosynthesize, and this one over here, this Indian pipe, doesn't photosynthesize as well. Look, notice it doesn't have green chlorophyll, nor does this have green chlorophyll, and so they're able to get nutrients from whatever plant they happen to be living on. So it's a parasitic relationship. Now, I wanted to bring up this because, as you might be familiar with me, that I really like redwood trees. There's a national park close by called Muir Woods National Park, and there's a tree there, redwood tree, coastal redwood tree, that's an albino. Check that out. It doesn't produce chlorophyll. And so just on the surface, you might think, well, how can it live? It won't be able to produce sugar through photosynthesis, but yet it does live. Look at this, ghostly like needles. And so it lives in association with sort of this parent tree. And so it just branches off. And so actually we're conducting a study looking at a particular gene. We've extracted the DNA from these needles, and we're trying to compare to see if they have the same DNA sequence. We're looking at GAPDH gene, and so that's an ongoing study. So that's pretty cool. Is it the same plant? Is it a different plant? We don't know. So this relationship is not parasitic. This is commensalism. But there are plants, like for example right here, there's a plant that lives on top of another plant. That's called an epiphyte. Epi means just simply upon, like epiglottis or epidermis. Epiphyte. So a plant that lives on top of something else. Sometimes it's mistaken for a parasite, but it causes no harm. It's autotrophic. It can photosynthesize on its own, as you can see here. And so what it does is it grows on the branches of other trees. And it's like, well, why would it do that? Well, these are fairly common in the tropical rainforest. In the tropical rainforest, you may be aware of the fact that on the forest floor, it's really dark, and the light comes in up here in the canopy. And so for some of these sort of slow-growing plants or short plants, you wouldn't be able to survive otherwise. And so when you're just a little seedling, you could hook on to a branch, and the big tree that grows really rapidly can take you for like an elevator ride or magic carpet ride all the way to the top so you can get plenty of sunlight. What's interesting is it's like, well, what's it going to do for water? Well, it can actually, these epiphytes can really get a lot of water from their leaves. They can actually, which is kind of unusual. Some of them have, look at this, really high up in the canopy. Some of them have long, long vine-like root system that goes all the way down to the ground. But they can live up here. And what's fascinating is, yeah, there's some dust that flies obviously in the canopy, and what can happen is that plants can actually, soil can actually develop right here, especially when these plants live and die in these crevices. And so you get this little community happening here and some buildup of soil, and so plants can live on top of other plants. It's quite remarkable. Bromeliad is a great example of that, as an example of an epiphyte. Staghorn Fern, have you ever seen that before? Look at this, Staghorn Fern. It's kind of unusual. And it's growing upon another plant, so it's considered to be an epiphyte. But orchids can be epiphytes right here as well. They're really unusual, and they're found commonly in the tropics. Another redwood example, this is the sort of a not tropical rainforest, but a temperate. It's not that warm, so it's a temperate rainforest, though it rains a lot in the coastal redwoods of Northern California along the coast. If you climb up to the top of a redwood tree, and I tell you, there's not very many people who have. There's a professor up at Humboldt State University named Professor Steve Sillett, and Dr. Sillett has been up to the top of these redwood trees and noticed in the canopy layer there's all kinds of epiphytes growing up there. And there's all kinds of unusual lichen and ferns and all kinds of berries and things. And so it's remarkable. There's even some soil up there. And so this is a real cool thing. I mean, we never thought that you would have such species diversity on the top of a forest. It's just yet another reason why we need to preserve and protect those redwood trees. And then finally, I'd like to talk to you about carnivorous plants. Now, this is totally wacky, but interesting. Like, now, what is up with this? Now, why are plants that are notoriously autotrophic? Well, even carnivorous plants are autotrophic. They're still photosynthesizing. They're still producing sugar through the process of photosynthesis. Then what up with eating animals then? They supplement their mineral nutrition, which means they're probably living on poor soil, if you guessed. And if you did, you guessed correctly. Now, they often live in acid bogs. I know, coming from an urban environment, we're not really familiar with this too much, but sort of swampy areas. Soil's not great at all. It's very acidic, so it's very difficult to get nutrients, especially nitrogen is particularly not available in these swampy areas. Lots of water, lots of frogs, stuff like this. And so the soil conditions are very poor, so I just wanted to point that out. And so how can plants survive in such an environment? Well, they could do it, like take a look at this. Some plants have such interesting modified leaves, look at this, that they actually form like a pitcher, like a water pitcher. And when I say water pitcher, I mean literally water is inside of this, because when it rains, it actually accumulates a sufficient amount of water. And what happens is, you notice how part of it up on the top here, I can switch pictures, top of this right here is very attractive to insects. Like, for example, there's bright coloration, sort of like petals. So that attracts flying insects. And then also on the underside right here, it produces a very sweet nectar and sugar. And of course, ants are attracted to this. This is a bog right here. And so, let me come back for a second. And so what happens is, little bugs or ants will crawl up here and they're like, interesting nectar, and they're eating this. But there's hard to see it. You'd need a microscope to see it, but there's these hairs on the outside of the leaf that are pointing in a downward direction. And so it makes it difficult for an ant, and then they also secrete kind of a slippery wax. This is brutal. So the insect comes over here and is like trying to have lunch, and then they fall into the water, and literally they cannot get out because these hairs are pointing in a downward direction. They simply drown. They're like, struggle, 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 and then they sink to the bottom. And then the plant, this is incredible, secretes hydrolytic enzymes that will actually digest the meat of those insects and actually extract the nitrogen from the protein and amino acids, and therefore subsidize the fact that it lives on very poor nitrogen soil. Maybe the most famous carnivorous plant of them all is the Venus flytrap, and I think it's famous especially because it's common, and not common, but it's found in northern North America and the United States. And this is crazy. When a fly lands on this, it'll actually trigger these little hairs, and the leaves close rapidly, and they even have like these tooth-like teeth that close on there. I've got to show you this. And what's interesting about this is you're like, well, how does it all work? Because usually motion is something that's controlled by muscle, but in fact, it's not muscle. It's really the rapid movement of water into the leaf, which causes an increase in turgor pressure, which then forces the Venus close. And so look at this. This is a poor, unsuspecting fly that's cruising around like this, and oh, it's all over and it's trapped. So the Venus flytrap has caught this, and now the fly, I'm almost feeling sorry for the fly. It can't get out. So ultimately it'll be digested and it'll die. And so the Venus flytrap will actually be able to get nitrogen from eating the fly. Isn't that brutal? And then check this out. I have another video here of, here's one of these pitcher plants. And so here's again an unsuspecting flying insect that's inside the pitcher plant. Now if it walks around the outside, it's probably fine, but now it's in trouble. Oh, it fell in. And so now it's inside and it's going to be digested. That's pretty brutal, huh? Yes, it is. And so let's go back over here and see what's coming. And so what I wanted to say is this is a picture of kind of a typical like boggy area, like maybe for example in Florida you'd find this. And so what you have here are your pitcher plants growing, and then this is not a real Venus flytrap, but this is from Plants vs. Zombies right here. So I thought I'd include that. That's a fun game to play. And then there's an unusual carnivorous plant. If you can see it down here, it's called a sundew. And this it grows really low to the ground, but check this out. Oh, let's see, I'll come back to the sundew. Here's another picture of the pitcher plant right here. And there's a lot of different species, so they each have their own sort of uniqueness to them. I find that interesting. They fill up with water, and then bugs go in there and drown. It's excellent. They have different colors. Look at this. They have different fragrances that will attract. And sometimes it's wild. They're so attractive that you get a bunch of bugs in here, like a whole bunch of ants, and the plant cannot digest them sufficiently, and it's just sort of like blocked up, like the plant's constipated. It has so many insects inside there. So this is what I was going to show you, is this sundew right here. Look at this. Here's a poor little fruit fly, the red eye wild type. They get stuck on there, and so what's that going to do? So these little sugaries right here will attract the insects, and then they get stuck in it, and then it literally closes rapidly, and then again the digestion process takes place, and you're like, what? I cannot believe how that could happen. And so check this out. Let's see if I can increase the size on this. And so here's a little tiny little bug, maybe an inchworm or something like this, and it comes up like this, and it's like, look, this looks pretty sweet, maybe I'll eat it. And so it's poking around, and then it's stuck. It's sort of like bubble gum. It's like sticking to the bug, and so it can't free itself, though it tries, and when it struggles, this is initiating an event inside the sundew where it has rapid movement. So check this out. It actually just coils up, and it sort of just suffocates the bug, and then ultimately all of those digestive juices will destroy and kill the bug. And so I don't know, I get people like predation. So that's kind of cool. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation today about parasitic plants, commensalism, and epiphytes, and then even some wild carnivorous plants. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.